Okay. Start. Good afternoon. Welcome to our weekly class on Pirkei Avos, Ethics of the Fathers. We're in the middle of chapter 5, and we're in the 5th Mishna, the 5th paragraph, and we're near the end of it. What is this about? This is about the 10 miracles that God wrought for our ancestors in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Holy Temple. And we went through 7 of them. So we're going to try to do the last 3 miracles, with bearing in mind that God does not do miracles needlessly, because God is the creator of the universe. If you are an artist and you drew a beautiful painting, why would you want to mess it up? Just because you're the artist and you could, doesn't mean you would or you should. So miracles are only performed by God, which means He alters the course of nature to some extent, only when there's a necessity for it, when it's there to teach us a lesson, when it's there to save someone. And even so, God prefers miracles that are vested within nature. That means that the miracles happen in a way that you could find some natural basis for it, though not enough to justify it or explain it, but at least it gives it some context. And the reason for that is that not because God can't do miracles or doesn't do miracles that are completely out of the realm of nature, but God's interest is not to show off that He can do miracles, because God could show off as easily as He by showing us nature. That's also divine. God does miracles in order to inspire us, in order to teach us lessons, and so on. So what are the last 3 miracles? 8, 9, and 10. The people stood pressed together. People were squeezed, yet bowed down and had room enough. In other words, when people entered the temple grounds, they were so crowded together that they were squeezed. Actually, the Hebrew word used here has another connotation which doesn't transmit in English, and that is they floated. How do you float in a crowd? When your feet don't touch the ground because it's so crowded. This is the way it was and still is in 770 Eastern Parkway, the headquarters of the Rabbi, on Rosh Hashanah especially. The crowd is so great that literally, not just figuratively, but literally, some people's feet would not touch the ground. The crowds were incredible, and that's what it was in the temple. So, and yet, they had to bow down because there were certain periods within the service where everyone bows down. There was plenty of room for everyone. That's an incredible miracle, and that's how most commentators explain this as a great miracle, that space did not exist. You had as many people as you can squeeze in there, not enough room left to throw in a feather, and yet when they had to bow, there was enough room for everyone. That's how most commentators interpret this. Maimonides, consistent with his style and approach to try to give things a natural context, seems to be suggesting the following, that this is what he says, and I'm going to try to add to it somewhat. People were in such awe of the presence of God in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Holy Temple, that they were able to constrict themselves. When you're filled with awe, fear, but in this case it's mostly awe and reverence, and to such an extent, you just didn't occupy as much space. And the way one could understand Maimonides' writings is based on a scientific fact that people have hidden powers that we rarely, if ever, we express. For example, a petite mother, could pick up a car to save a child. We have heard many stories like that. I heard a story of someone who had to escape a fire and went through a crack in the fence. And later on, when they came back to visit the site that they escaped from, there was no way they can get through that crack. It was just too narrow and they were too big. They just couldn't. In the times of crisis, in times of emergency, we develop, whether it's the adrenaline, it's other bodily functions that give us power that we could never have imagined that we have. In fact, in Jewish sources, they refer to these powers as kochot hanelamim, the hidden powers that we have. And the way I saw some description of these powers is that most of the time we don't exhibit these powers because we don't have to. They're not necessary. You don't have to use extraordinary powers to lift a book, to lift a phone. Most of our lives don't call for us to exhibit these powers, these forces. But there are certain times in our lives when we do have to, and we find the ability to do this. And you can see in so many areas of life where people, let me just mute them, where people who you went to school with some people, and they were average or below average. And they turned out to be the most incredible people in their lives. They accomplished more than the people in the top of the class. What do they say in the law school? The A students become professors. The B students become, what do the B students become? Judges. And the C students become corporate lawyers and make all the money. I may have butchered that joke, but that's what they say. And sometimes it's the C, or the lower than that, who become the most influential and most successful people. And the reason for that is because the A people, didn't feel they had to exert themselves. They didn't feel they had to work hard. I know people in that category, brilliant people, but they were lazy because they didn't have to work hard, and they didn't really amount to that much. And people who were far inferior, their talents were not as great as the A people, they worked hard. They really exerted themselves, and they became very special in their fields. So this is what Maimonides seems to be saying, that when you entered into Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, the awe that it generated, the reverence, the feeling of total submission to a higher force, that revealed their hidden powers, their spiritual hidden powers, and even their physical hidden powers, that they were able to fit many more people into the temple than you would imagine could have fit there under any other circumstances. And they were able to even bow down. They had room. They had ample room. So that's the reason for this miracle. This miracle teaches us that we as human beings sell ourselves short when we think our abilities are limited. Of course, they're limited ultimately. We're still physical beings, but they're far more capable than we imagine them to be. And if we put the effort into it, we could change and grow into something that we could not have imagined before. Now, why would God perform this miracle? So I just gave an explanation based on Maimonides, but there are others who give simpler explanations why this miracle was necessary. And it also has a moral lesson to it. When the people, Yom Kippur especially, when people would bow, they would also recite words of confession for their sins. On Yom Kippur, we ask God for forgiveness, and there are who knows how many times during the service, 10 times at least, when we ask God to forgive us for our sins. When people would bow down, if they would be so crowded together and you're reciting your sins, it would be very embarrassing that the person next to you would hear every sin you committed. And people would be listening very closely to try to, what did my neighbor do? So in order to avoid that embarrassment, God performed this miracle. And this also has a powerful lesson. How far a person has to go to what lengths a person has to go to avoid embarrassing another person. That God is willing to alter nature, to perform this miracle in order to prevent someone from becoming embarrassed. The Talmud mentions something about embarrassing someone in public, and it says that if you embarrass someone in public, you were better off being thrown into a fiery furnace. And it cites a biblical story. The biblical story was Yehuda, the fourth son of Jacob, had his two sons married to this woman Tamar. The first son died, the second son died, and the father, justifiably was concerned that this woman would not be safe for his third son, because Jewish law requires that when a man dies without children, that the widow should marry, in those days, a relative, close relative of the husband, of the husband who died. And he had a third son, and he was afraid to have his daughter-in-law marry him. So he just didn't let her marry him. So one day she disguised herself as a prostitute, and she seduced him on the road to where he was going, and she conceived. 3 months later, Yehuda, not knowing who she was, because she covered her face, disguised herself, Yehuda is told that she conceived, and she was not allowed to marry anyone because she was bound to marry the son-in-law, the son rather of Yehuda, her husband's brother. So they were very strict about the morals in those days, and he issued a death sentence that she should be burnt. And she had a way of getting out of it by saying, Yehuda, my dear Yehuda, you're the man, you're the father of this child, so I didn't go out of the family, I had a relationship with you. But she didn't say that, because she didn't want to embarrass him. Instead, she hinted, she says, he gave her things for collateral, for payment, and she says, whoever owns these things is the man who has caused me to conceive. And the Talmud says she was prepared to be thrown into a fiery furnace rather than to publicly shame Yehuda. From this we learn how far a person has to go not to embarrass another person in public. Not in private either, but especially not in public. Now, is it an exaggeration that you'd have to rather die than shame someone? That's a discussion amongst the commentators. Some say yes. So that's how far you have to go. And the Talmud says by embarrassing someone in public, you are guilty of bloodshed. I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago. When you embarrass someone, what happens? The blood drains from their face and they turn white, and the blood then comes back. So you're shedding the blood. You're actually causing the blood to move. So it's literal bloodshed, but it's figurative bloodshed as well. You're destroying their honor, their dignity by embarrassing them. If a person is ever embarrassed, however, the way they should look at it as, God is causing me to suffer, but this suffering absolves me of many of my sins. So there's always a silver lining in everything. But the person who does it cannot say, I want this person to be cleansed of his sins, so I'm going to embarrass him in public. No, you can't do that. That's not the proper. So here, the reason why God performs this miracle, which means that God goes out of his way, because that's not God's way. God loves and cherishes nature, but he does it to prevent the embarrassment of people. Other commentators explain it in a different way, figuratively, metaphorically, that when we're talking about people who were standing crowded, squeezed together, it's also a metaphor. Sometimes in our lives we're squeezed, we're so pressured, we're so filled with anxiety because we have so much pressure that doesn't give us any room to breathe. We're suffocating under the burden of all of our problems, economic problems, health problems, family problems, what have you. Whatever problems there are, people are crushed. And if a person has a higher consciousness, he bows. Bowing is a metaphor for recognizing that there are higher things in life that transcend all of my issues and all of my problems than they feel they can breathe. We know people, different personality types, when they have, life is not going their way, when you're under a lot of pressure, you just can't handle it, and you just fall apart. And there are people who could live through it with joy and equanimity, and they're not crushed by it. They have a lot of suffering. I knew people who, if you only knew how much suffering they went through, you would wonder how they survived, and they were always cheerful and happy. These are people who suffered on many levels. They suffered with their family members who were not well. They suffered with their own illnesses. They suffered economically. Nothing was going for them, and yet they were always cheerful. I remember I met a Holocaust survivor who told me his story. I forgot his last name. The man was smiling. He was just such a cheerful man. In Auschwitz, he hid. When they were taking everyone to the gas chamber, he hid in a pile of clothing. That everyone had to take off their clothing, and they piled it up, and the forklift would take it away. So he hid in the pile of clothing, and the forklift got him out of the place. And he survived Auschwitz. And then he was diagnosed with cancer. The advanced cancer, metastatic cancer. And he said, the doctor died, but he's still alive. This is decades later. And then he was diagnosed with an incurable heart condition. And the man was cheerful, like anything. The man went through everything, and he was still so cheerful. And I knew many such people over the years. The story is told of a great Hasidic master, Reb Zusha. Reb Zusha was one of the poorest people around. He had nothing. But the story is that a certain Chassid came to Reb Zusha's teacher, known as the Magid of Mezrich. Rabbi Dov Ber was his name, Dov Ber. And he said, I studied something in the Talmud and I can't comprehend it. It says in the Talmud that you're supposed to thank God for the bad things that happen to you just as you do for the good. I can't understand that. I can't grasp that. Could you explain it to me? And the rabbi said, go to my student Zusha, he'll explain it to you. So he looks for Zusha. He thought he has a nice house, he's a respected rabbi. No, he lived in a hut, in a shack at the edge of town. It looked like it was going to fall apart any minute. It was one room, and he goes inside and he sees such poverty, no furniture. He had some wood and some rocks to serve as chairs. A table was a plank of wood over some rocks. He saw that the children were emaciated. They were dressed in tatters. Zusha himself looked like he was the poorest man around. And Zusha had a big smile on his face and says, what can I do for you? He says, well, you're mad that happens to you the same way as the good. Zusha, that's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. But why did the master send you to me? I never experienced anything bad in my life. How could I answer your question? Not everyone is Zusha, obviously. But the approach to deal with deal with adversity in life is one that is for everyone. Everyone, we all have to learn this. It's a challenge. We all have to learn how to deal with adversity. And the way to deal with it, one of the ways to deal with it, is to bow. Recognize that there's something above you, someone, a God who knows everything about you, who cares for you, and eventually everything will make sense. When Mashiach will come, we'll understand all the suffering, and all the suffering will cease. When you have a higher purpose in life and you devote your life to doing good for others and serving God, that's the idea of bowing metaphorically, then you're able to transcend all of the suffering and all of the pain and all of the tightness that you're experiencing. So when it says in the temple everyone was tight, but they were able to bow down with ample space because they bowed, and the bowing gives them that ability. Then it says, no snake or scorpion harmed anyone in Jerusalem. Israel is filled with snakes and scorpions. I don't know now. More probably a lot of scorpions. What about the snakes? Yeah, a lot of snakes. But in those days, probably a lot more. And there are many poisonous brands of snakes and scorpions. The Talmud discusses if you're praying and a snake comes towards you, what should you do? I guess if it's not a poisonous snake, do nothing. If it's a scorpion, run. So apparently the scorpions in those days were more deadly than they are today. Although today they can... What?
Ask the Heschel.
You ask the snake.
Poison or not?
Well, of course. I guess people, when you live around snakes, you get to learn which ones are poisonous, which ones are not. And if in doubt, run.
I'd run anyway.
So even though there were a lot of snakes and scorpions, and there were a lot of underground channels in the temple. In fact, where's the ark? The ark is buried beneath the temple grounds. There are chambers there, and the snakes and scorpions hide out on the earth. In spite of that, no one was ever harmed by a snake or scorpion. In Jerusalem, not just in the temple, but in the whole city of Jerusalem. It doesn't say no one was bit. No one was bit by a snake or scorpion, but if they were, it didn't harm them. That was the miracle. In other words, God went out of his way to make living in Jerusalem, or coming to Jerusalem, mostly for the people who came, to have a comfortable presence there. They shouldn't have to be concerned about being harmed by snakes and scorpions. So it's another example of how God performs a miracle for the benefit of the people, how God cares for us. But there's also a metaphoric understanding. Snakes and scorpions are two different kinds of threats to us spiritually. The Talmud discusses the difference between snakes and scorpions in terms that relate to us. Snakes have a hot venom. Scorpions have a cold venom. I don't know how to translate it in scientific terms, but I think it means that the cold venom is where it affects the nerves. It desensitizes us. It causes the nerves to be harmed. The hot venom is that enters our bloodstream and poisons us. What is the metaphor behind that? There are two things in our lives that cause us problems in terms of our spirituality. There's the snake, the hot venom, and the scorpion, the cold venom. Hot venom means passion. How many times do people do things that are wrong because of passion? They get angry, they explode, and they go out and they kill someone. I mean, today you don't have to, every day in the newspapers, every day you'll hear of so many stories of someone got into an argument, road rage, and they took a gun and they shot someone. What motivated it? Just the impulsive desire to act on your on any feeling that you have. I feel I was harmed, you slighted me. I remember, this is in my memory for decades, I once started driving and I wasn't a good driver, and I cut off someone on a motorcycle, and he started screaming at me, "If you do this again, I'll kill you." And you know what? He probably meant it. People in road rage can do anything. That's a snake type of, that's a hot type of evil. Or other crimes of passion where people commit adultery or people commit other sexual crimes. It's based on passion. It's based on heat. And those are terribly destructive. Then there's the scorpion, the cold venom. Cold venom is where you're desensitized, where you don't feel anything. You don't care about anyone. You don't care about anything meaningful in life. People become desensitized. They become indifferent, apathetic. They don't have any interest in learning. You know, the famous joke, someone once asked someone, what's worse, indifference or ignorance? And the person answered, I don't know and I don't care. They usually go together. That person was bitten by a scorpion. That's cold venom. No interest, no, cold to everything, insensitive to everything. When you enter the temple, or you entered even Jerusalem the atmosphere was so pregnant with holiness, with intense spiritual energy, that if you were cold, you would become hot. If you were too hot for the wrong things, your heat, your passion would be redirected in the right way. That's the power of Jerusalem. What does the word Jerusalem mean? Why was it called Jerusalem? Because it originally had another name. It used to be called Shalem. And Abraham added the name Yirah. And Yirah Shalem became Jerusalem, Yerushalayim. They put the two words together. What does Yirah mean and what does Shalem mean? Shalem means complete. Peace is shalom, but it's related. When there's peace, things are whole. What does Yirah mean? Yirah means awe, reverence. It's a city of perfect, complete reverence. What is reverence? Reverence means when you have this profound awareness of God's presence and you have the proper response to it with respect, with awe and reverence. And Jerusalem was the place that generated that atmosphere. Today, Jerusalem is a cosmopolitan city and it has all sorts of materialistic things. One of the things that turned me off, you could say, when I went to Jerusalem, I went on the way to the Temple Mount, I saw the commercialization of the area. That took away some of the inspiration. When you went to Jerusalem, I don't have to go to Jerusalem to go to a restaurant on my way to the Western Wall. I don't have to see all the commercial things and the people selling and buying things. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that it's a sin to do that. But Jerusalem is about being in an atmosphere of something that's holy, something that's whole, something that's godly. And that's why when you enter Jerusalem, in those days especially, there were no snakes or scorpions that you had to worry about, literally or figuratively.
Today there's the worst thing in Jerusalem, called snake and scorpion.
They're called people. Yeah.
People and, God forbid, weird people.
Or cars in Israel, unfortunately. The next one, no man, no person said to his fellow, "The place is too congested for me to lodge overnight in Jerusalem." No one had to leave Jerusalem, Rashi explains, because of a lack of livelihood. Crowded here doesn't mean, according to Rashi, crowded literally that there's no room to move around. In the temple there was no room. But in Jerusalem, it's too crowded. That means too many people are competing for the same things. So people would say, I can't live in Jerusalem. There's no room for my livelihood. There are 1,000 people teaching violin. I have no room for Max to teach violin. There's plenty of room.
I have room.
Plenty of
Go to Jerusalem, I have room.
Plenty of room for everyone.
With violin, I don't need to bring violin with for me.
Now, others say this, literally, it was crowded. You have to remember, Jerusalem at that time was very limited in space. It's not like Jerusalem today. Jerusalem today is a much larger city. I don't know what percentage it was. It was probably a third or less of what it is today. When the pilgrimage holidays occurred, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, you had hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million Jews who come to the pilgrimage, and they all stayed in Jerusalem. Take a million, it's probably more closer to 2 million people. Take 2 million people from New York City who decide, you know what, we want to see the falls, and they all come at the same time and they stay in Buffalo. It would be overwhelming. A few hundred migrants come to a town and people are going crazy. What do we do with them? They can't handle them. And here you had 2 million migrants coming to Jerusalem, and there was plenty of room to sleep. No one ever complained. So commentators said it doesn't say that there was plenty of room for them to sleep. There wasn't. but they didn't complain. That's the miracle. Now, it sounds like a joke, but Chassam Sofer, one of the great 19th century, very serious commentators, doesn't say it as a joke. He says it seriously, that the miracle was that they actually endured the hardship and they enjoyed it. They didn't complain about it. Why didn't they complain? Because when you're with your family, let's say your family, and even in a family we have family feuds, of course, but in a family that's not dysfunctional, has no family feuds, and all of a sudden you have room in your house for 4 people, and then 12 relatives come that you really like, do you feel crowded? Don't stay too long, but as long as they're not staying too long, you're thrilled that they're able to squeeze in, and you have plenty of room for everyone. You have room for another 10. They tell this story, that it's probably a joke, about this man comes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I can't live, I have one room in my house and it's so crowded, there's no room for me to move around. So the rabbi says, do you have chickens? He says, yeah, they're outside. He says, bring them into the house. How is that going to help? Just do what I say. He brings in the chickens and he comes back to the rabbi, it's getting worse. I can't handle it. It was bad enough without the chickens. He says, do you have a goat? Bring him in. And he says, Rabbi, there's no room. Rabbi, you came to me for advice. You listened to me. Bring in the goat. He brings in the goat. He complains to the rabbi. Things are getting even worse. He says, do you have a cow and a horse? Bring them in. And the man says, I'm going to die. I can't handle this. The rabbi says, okay, take out the cow and the horse and the goat and the chickens. And the man says, wow, Rabbi, it's incredible. There's so much room to breathe. Everything, it's in the head. Crowded, the feeling of being crowded is not in the body, it's in the mind. There's a statement in the Talmud, a very powerful statement that someone once said, when we were in love, even a blade of the sword was sufficient. We could both have laid down on the blade of a sword. Now that the love weakened, even a bed 60 cubits wide, 90 feet wide, does not suffice. In other words, if you love someone, there's no reason to feel crowded. If you don't love someone, you can have all the space in the world, you still feel crowded. The Rabbi once explained that the miracle in Jerusalem came from the miracle in the temple, because people bowed. Bowing means I'm able to bow and lower my stature, not assert myself, lower the ego. If you're able to lower your ego, there's room for everyone. And not only was there room for everyone in the temple, but even in Jerusalem, the bowing in the temple, the lessening of the ego, allowed us to breathe in Jerusalem and not even feel crowded. And this is not saying you don't have to be a very holy person to feel this. Any person who is in a place where they love to be doesn't mind the crowd. You come to 770 Eastern Parkway, when the Rebbe was there, you had, as I mentioned before, you had thousands of people in an area that could fit maybe a few hundred, and you had thousands of people there, and everyone was squeezed together. I always tell this joke, when sardines get together in their can, they say it's as crowded as it is in 770 Eastern Parkway. And you know what? People didn't feel that they were being squeezed. People had enough room. It was not a problem. And we actually saw the idea of having room, having space. When the Rebbe would walk into the shul, and there was no room to move an inch or a millimeter, and all of a sudden the crowd parted. It's like the splitting of the Red Sea, and the Rebbe would walk through with plenty of room to spare. That's when you have love, and you're together for a higher purpose, and your ego is not as big as it usually is. You lower your ego, you have room for everyone. And the greatest miracle, again, is that you won't complain. That's something that we have to strive for. So all these miracles were miracles that were performed for a purpose, to teach us lessons. Very powerful lessons as well. I have a question that I mentioned last week, there were other miracles in the temple that are not mentioned here. For example, the ark itself was the greatest miracle. The ark itself, let's say this is the ark, and the ark is in the room, and it was, let's say, 20 feet from here to here, and 20 feet from here to here. But the whole room was only 40 feet wide. The ark itself, although it was 2.5 cubits, which is about 4 to 5 feet, didn't occupy any space. It occupied space, but it didn't occupy the space simultaneously. It's like taking an elephant and putting it through the eye of a needle without putting the elephant on a diet and without enlarging the eye of the needle. It occupies space, but it doesn't occupy space. That miracle is not mentioned over here. One reason, perhaps, is that the ark was not present in the second temple. And these were miracles that occurred even in the second temple, which was not as holy as the first temple. Another explanation is that there's no lesson for us. No one ever saw it. The ark was in the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest, one day a year, would be able to see it. So it didn't present itself to us that we witnessed that miracle and we couldn't learn lessons from something you didn't really see. That may be another reason. But there were other miracles as well. For example, the light of the menorah, one of the 7 branches, would not extinguish. It had to be extinguished so they could rekindle it every night. And that miracle, the Talmud says, had a purpose. The purpose was to tell the world that the divine presence rested within the Jewish people. So that's a very powerful lesson. So the question is, why wasn't that mentioned as an 11th miracle? And again, the answer might be that it only happened during the first temple and in the opening years of the second temple. But after Shimon HaTzadik, one of the great Jewish leaders, the beginning of the second temple era, passed away, that miracle ceased. So maybe that's why it's not mentioned. There was another miracle, that the showbread that they would put on the table on Shabbos remained hot all week long, even though it was not on a source of heat. And that was something that they did show people. They would pick up the table and show people who from the distance, and the idea was to show how much God loves us, that he would keep the bread that was on the table warm. Now, that miracle did not happen in the second temple again. So that's the closest I can get to giving an answer. Until such time, I didn't see any commentators discussing it, but I'm sure I'll find someone who does. Any questions? Any answers? Any questions on Zoom? We now need a big miracle. We need Mashiach to come and bring peace to the world.
Amen.
That's the miracle we need now.
So people can do nothing.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a nice day.
You too. What?
So people can do nothing about